One important thing that Darwin did as a good naturalist, a good biologist, is he took detailed observations and notes on these organisms, plants and animals that he collected and observed. And he noticed that they were well suited to their diverse environments, meaning that they had the traits or adaptations, as we'll call them soon, that allowed them to survive in the diverse habitats or environments where he found them. So some of his observations were, most importantly or most famously, on the Galápagos Islands, which is a number of volcanic islands in the Pacific, about almost 600 or so miles off the coast of South America, where he found numerous organisms that were very unique, and some only found on these islands or endemic to these particular islands. So most of these animals were found nowhere else in the world, but he noted they did resemble some of the South American species that he had seen earlier. So he noticed, for example, that the marine iguanas in the Galápagos, which are the only marine iguanas in the world, had kind of flattened tails that help them in swimming in the water. They actually, they're herbivores. They eat plant material and algae that grow on the rocks, on the coastal rocks underwater. So they were different and distinct, meaning different than the land-dwelling iguanas that were found on the Galápagos and also on the South American mainland. So also, for example, each island has its own distinct variety and species of giant tortoise with their unique characteristics, in particular the shape of their shells and whether they eat low-lying plant matter or shrub-like plants where they have to actually reach up. So their shells have changed and adapted to their particular environments. Little video here. Hopefully we'll get the audio and have it playing on the Galápagos. Hopefully that'll start up for us. Hopefully. If not, I might have to post it separately. Just a short video highlighting some of the organisms on the Galápagos Islands and some nice visuals. And I did have some trouble with it loading earlier, so I will post that separately. Okay, so some further insights that influenced Darwin's thinking. Darwin was influenced by a geologist, Charles Lyell, and his book, Principles of Geology, which argued for an ancient Earth that had been sculpted and modified over millions of years by gradual geologic processes that continue today. So if you remember earlier, we talked about how some early naturalists or biologists proposed that the Earth was only about 6,000 years old, trying to get that information from biblical sources. But what Lyell and other geologists proposed was that the Earth actually is very, very ancient, millions of years old, and that natural processes that shaped the Earth in the past are still going on, like uplifting of hills and mountains, weathering and deposition of sediments, and modification of rock, for example, lava, magma, etc. These processes that have shaped the world, which do take a very long time, wearing down the erosion of mountains, must indicate that the world actually is very, very old. So Darwin was influenced by these thoughts because Darwin thought that, well, if the Earth is changing slowly, gradually over millions of years, perhaps so are the plants and animals that are living on the Earth. So Darwin analyzed his observations from his trip on the Beagle, many of the specimens he collected and looked at more carefully once he brought them back to England. He discussed with colleagues and hypothesized that present-day species are descendants of ancient ancestors. So he was establishing the framework for his theory of evolution by natural selection. So his thought process was that over time, differences gradually accumulated by what he referred to as descent with modification, meaning change in organisms over generational and even geologic time. So he proposed a mechanism for how life evolves, and his process is called natural selection, and this is shown to be correct. Remember, Lamarck proposed a mechanism that was incorrect. So in natural selection, individuals with certain inherited traits, remember traits that can be passed on from generation to generation, so individuals with certain beneficial traits are more likely to survive, reach adulthood, reproduce, and pass those inherited traits on to their offspring than are other individuals or other individuals with certain traits within the same population, with the same group of organisms. So I found this really simple picture here of woodpeckers that kind of illustrates the idea. So woodpeckers peck into the bark of trees, and they're digging for insects and grubs to eat. So in this example, simple example, these are two members, individuals of the same type of woodpecker. However, they have traits that can be inherited. In other words, one member, this woodpecker has a longer beak or bill than this one. So it's able to reach insects, grubs, in a part of the tree that the other one can't. So the other one can reach insects and grubs that are more on the surface, and so can this one, but it can also reach insects and grubs that are deeper. So because of that, this individual has an advantage. It can find more food than this one. So just because of that, it is more likely to reach adulthood, more likely to be healthy, more likely to be able to reproduce, and more likely to pass on the trait, that inherited trait, to its offspring. It doesn't mean that all of its offspring are going to have longer beaks, but some of them will. Versus this guy, he's less likely to be well nourished. He's less, or she is less likely to reach adulthood, less likely to pass on those traits to its offspring. So the idea is that this beneficial trait that's heritable, and it's beneficial in this particular environment, will build up in the population over time. And then what we see here on the right is an evolutionary tree, or something called a phylogeny that we'll define later, but it's showing modifications of the organisms over time. And what we see here is a lineage of ancestors that led to the current living species of elephants today, the Asian and the African elephant. So certain modifications have built up over time, like the enlarged trunk and tusks, which are modified teeth. And again, the important thing here is how this occurs, how these organisms change or evolve over time, and that's through the process of natural selection. So as descendants of a remote ancestor spread into various habitats over millions of years, and we're talking a little bit here about the examples with the Galápagos Islands, but this occurs everywhere. Natural selection resulted in changes, modifications, or what we can technically call evolutionary adaptations to their environments. And these changes allowed these organisms to fit well to specific ways of life in their environments. So the classic example here are Darwin's finches. So what he proposed, after examining the different species of finches on the Galápagos Islands, he proposed that, well, they're all finches. Some are more similar than others, and they're somewhat similar to finches on the mainland of South America. So what Darwin proposed is that in the past, there was an ancestral group of finches one species that arrived on the Galapagos Islands, and over time, as those finches spread across the islands and started to specialize in eating different types of food, because the individuals within the original population of finches had certain variations. Some had slightly larger beaks, some had slightly pointier beaks, etc. Just like if you look at a group of individuals, humans, for example, some have bigger noses, some have smaller noses. Okay, for example, there's variation in populations. So as those organisms took advantage of the different food resources, in other words, there's specific ways of obtaining nutrients and living, they started to specialize in their food because of their variations, and then those variations built up in those little groups over time, kind of like the simple picture here. Eventually, those changes built up and led to different groups of birds that became different species through what's called speciation events. And that's what this branching means on this tree of life for just the finches, or this phylogeny just for these finches. And that led to these evolutionary adaptations over time, descent with modification, ultimately leading to these species of finches that inhabit the Galapagos today. So he spent over 2 decades studying, compiling, and writing about evidence for evolution. He looked at a number of different organisms, plants, pigeons, etc., and waited a while before proposing his theory to the scientific community. Then, another British naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was doing field work in parts of Indonesia, conceived of a hypothesis to explain evolution that was almost identical to Charles Darwin. He actually wrote to Charles Darwin and said, "Mr. Darwin, I have come up with an explanation for how organisms change over time. What do you think?" And Charles Darwin thought, "Oh my God, this guy's going to steal my thunder," in a way. So they collaborated, they proposed their concepts together. Alfred Russel Wallace and the scientific community in England agreed that Charles Darwin's work had come first, so he got all the notoriety, which is why today most people know Charles Darwin, but not Alfred Russel Wallace. So Darwin published his book on the origin of species by the means of natural selection back in 1859, and that shook the world scientific community because of his proposal. Actually, 2 proposals in his book: that existing species descended from ancestral species. That evolution led to speciation. So that contradicted the long-standing, for many naturalists, the long-standing thought that species were fixed. That was already kind of changing, that thought, but Darwin pushed it further in a way. And also that natural selection was the mechanism that drove evolution. So that's probably the most famous proposal he made. Natural selection is driving evolution, and evolution occurs because organisms descend from their ancestral species. That modification with descent idea. So Darwin's hypothesis for evolution has generated many predictions that have been tested, experimented, and verified by over 150 years of research. That's quite a long time. Most importantly, in a way, is in that over 150 years, there's been no valid scientific evidence to contradict Darwin's theory of evolution. So Darwin's concept of evolution by means of natural selection is a theory, which in science speak is a widely accepted explanatory idea that is supported by an enormous, vast body of evidence. In this case, over 150 years of accumulated evidence. And we'll get into some of the evidence in the next section.